Hi guys, and welcome back to SwitchUp. My name's Mark Walker, and today we're looking at the much anticipated King's Bounty 2, which acts as a direct sequel to the first game released in 1990. There was a reasonably successful spin-off game, King's Bounty: The Legends, but that also was 13 years ago. It's a huge open-world tactical RPG that combines elements of the original games along with some more traditional ideas that you might find in a game like Skyrim. Is this much belated sequel a beautiful bounty, or a bag full of bugs and one potentially you should bypass? Well, let's find out. Another day, another dark plague that's about to destroy the world, this time known as Nostria. You can take on the role of 3 different heroes, each of them with their own characters, backstories, and they're all fully voice acted.
I'm Catherine, Countess of Rigor, in case you've forgotten.
As with something like The Witcher, the game is divided into a main quest line, side quests, and a ton of tertiary activities. However, the latter is a bit thin on the ground. Narrative delivery is something King's Bounty does really well. While not all the voice acting is cut from the same cloth, you'll rarely be scratching your head as to what's going on, and it's quite clear as to your motivations.
Great dumb razzle. Grant you permission to ask.
But personally for me, the heart of a good RPG comes in those side missions. Thankfully, these are also fully voice acted. You'll find an unusual cast of characters and an equally unusual set of quests. Things like helping a long deceased skeleton mage to protect his village now long abandoned, clearing out troll-filled caves, or solving brutal murders are all part and parcel when it comes to side quests. Initially, you'll find yourself in a frozen tundra, held in captivity for a crime you may or may not have committed, but are released in short order to help with the growing crisis. The experience then is divided into 2 main areas, the overworld questing and the tactical turn-based combat. We'll start with that overworld experience. This first frozen area acts as a tutorial of sorts. It introduces you to the idea of purchasing and recruiting troops, searching for lost items and treasure, and performing side quests and missions. Controls are standard fare, however, I have a very large issue with one thing, and that's the speed at which your character ambles around the world. They move ludicrously slowly, and you'll find yourself constantly pressing buttons to make them sprint to no avail. Then you realise you can summon your horse with the press of a button, so you leap into the saddle, ready to fly off to your next quest. And that happens. This legitimately is the top speed of a horse in King's Bounty 2. It makes absolutely no sense to me other than one theory that I have. You'll see even just from these few early images that performance isn't great, and I have to ask myself, did they limit the speed you can move to try and enable the game to stream the assets in quick enough so that it isn't a complete slideshow? Certainly, as we'll see from the performance segment, that could have been the case. Borrowing heavily from Skyrim, you'll find a series of shrines around the world which will grant your player a temporary blessing, and there's a fast travel pillar system. Combat's very unlike most RPGs. It's not a game where you'll find combat instances every 5 to 10 minutes, you may even go hours without a fight. That's because combat's very often treated as an invisible gating system. It will block off entire areas of the map, and you'll want to build up your army and level enough so that you can actually pass these, but more on that when we look at combat. Now, your character has a number of levels as you'd expect, but what's a really nice and interesting system is that your growth is split into 4 different areas, and you can boost these as well through your choices in missions. Say for example, one mission gave you 2 different options, kill someone or spare them. In King's Bounty, that means something. Your character will begin to lean towards one of these characteristics. The troops that you have under your command will fall under one of the 4 categories, and as such, the more you lean in an area, the more they'll respond in terms of their morale. It also means that you don't want to mix troops of different types, but you won't always have that option. If you look up here, you can see your character's leadership ability. This limits the amount of troops you can hire, and while it might be cheaper to put together troops from different factions, this will then lower their morale and their ability to fight. So it's a risk-reward mechanic built into a system that feeds upon the player's choices, which I absolutely love. The 3 main characters are 3 different classes. There's a warrior, a magic user, and one that falls somewhere in between. Let's look at the combat then, after which we'll concentrate on the world itself. Combat is something the player chooses to go into. When you approach a combat instance, you can see a barrier with the enemies loitering around inside. They'll come to the edge, match to face off against you, but it's only when you enter that combat begins. Your army, as well as the opposition force, are shown on this screen, and you can have any number of reserves, but your main lineup are the ones that will have to fight. A quick additional piece of information is that any apparel you place on your character, helmets, weapons, don't directly affect them, it affects your army. Things like increasing your overall warfare skill or improving their shielding. Now once battle commences, it's quite standard. Based on a hexagonal grid system, you'll initially place your troops. They can be placed behind cover to block line of sight or use elevated ground to improve their range. Your character acts as a commander and won't actually take part in the battle. Turns are shown in an interesting way. It's a simple numbering system on the banners, ranging from 1 to 10, with 1 being the next person to take a turn. It's an important mechanic that's not really explained to the player, and it's where much of the tactical decision making comes from. Most units will have a special ability or power, and my main character, focusing on magic, could use 1 spell per round. These prove to be game changing, especially with the severe difficulty that some of these battles present. I enjoyed the combat, but it did feel a little unbalanced. It's not that it's particularly difficult per se, it's just that very often you'll be pitted against enemies far superior to your own army. The game, unbeknownst to the player, is steering you towards completing many of those side activities before you then try and progress. It was a frustrating feeling, and it made it feel like many of the battles were unwinnable until you're a higher level. This is certainly not a new concept when it comes to RPGs, with them often forcing you to grind before you can move on, but in King's Bounty's defense, I did find that shuffling up your army or changing the types of troops usually meant there was a way to win. Things like using a load of ranged troops against trolls who were insanely strong but really slow, and then there's the free respecking of the skills tree. This looks to be another method through which the developers want to empower the player to be able to overcome some of these more difficult situations. I totally respect to the power class, filling my army with trolls and bears, and was able to overcome a couple of the previously unwinnable fights. That, in my opinion, isn't difficulty, but it can be frustrating, as at no point does the game come close to explaining it. Finally then, we've got the world itself. Artistically speaking, it's quite strong. There are some striking vistas, there's a good bit of verticality, but there's also too much restriction for the player. You can't go hopping over that fence and explore what's behind. You certainly won't be setting your horse off at a gallop to explore. King's Bounty 2 is such an interesting game because despite its flaws, I still found myself compelled to play it. I love the system of having the different side quests really affect the core army morale and the types of troops you could then choose. You'd formed the character. But you have to have the core mechanics right. You need to have the run speed so that you don't feel frustrated. You have to balance the difficulties, or at least explain to the player how different systems work. And that for me isn't in place as it stands in King's Bounty 2, but would be so easy to fix. Story and storytelling plays a big part in the game, and it lifts up the experience. Story and gameplay combined then currently score 15 out of 20. The controls are okay. It would have been really nice to have a jump button and a real run function. Controls score 15 out of 20.
Gathered you here today.
When it comes to visuals, performance and audio, King's Bounty 2 is once again a mixed bag. Clearly the art direction is decent, with the structural designs of the buildings all being supplemented with tons of handwritten notes and lore. There's a great contrast between the different areas you'll visit, and some of the characters look great. But on the flip side of that, you'll encounter several that look half-baked, as if the developers ran out of time making their faces. Animations in combat are strong, with some really nice spell effects. But then what on earth happened to that run animation? Why does the horse keep glitching out as it turns against an object? And oh goodness, that frame rate. Now in that first area it's stuck at about 30 FPS, but as soon as you enter the first major city, you'll see those frame rates drop right down. At times it will stutter down to 20, 22 frames per second, and it seems to be entirely uncapped. This fluctuation between high and low is where most of the problems come from, but as scenery pops up in front of you, things load in slowly, you begin to notice the aliasing and jaggy edges on the sides of all the objects. You can see that the developers struggled with the Nintendo Switch hardware. We are promised in the review notes that there will be a number of patches following launch, and there are some areas where the developer have put in the extra time. There's a text size option here, which is something we always ask for, but bafflingly, it doesn't actually change the size of all the text in the game. As far as sound design and audio goes, King's Bounty has a beautiful soundtrack. And it's very reminiscent to Skyrim's. The ambient tracks that play as you move about the world are great. There's lots of environmental sounds. The world feels alive in that sense. And hats off to the developer for taking the time to voice act every single line of dialogue in this game. It really does make the difference. And although my main character had a slightly annoying personality, the voice actor did a good job of creating that character. Visuals and performance as they stand on Switch scored 10 out of 20. The sound and audio design are excellent, with only occasional inconsistencies. That scores 16 out of 20. Finally, we've got value. The game is, in my opinion, ultra premium. It's £54.99 in the UK eShop or your regional equivalent. As far as content goes, it's massive. This is a very large game indeed. You only need to throw a stone in any direction in the world and you'll have a side quest to perform, and before you know it, you will have a bulging log on your hands. Quest log. I do fear though that many players will turn off before they can overcome and truly experience what the full game has to offer. The map is vast and the lore's really well handled if you can get that far without finding yourself frustrated. And obviously when you're paying premium, you expect premium performance, and that's not what you're getting here. Overall value scores 13 out of 20. So there we have it for King's Bounty as it stands. There's so much potential for greatness here, and with a few simple tweaks they could make the game much better. Increase the run speed by 50%, do the same for the horse, and try to articulate some of the nuances of combat a little bit better earlier in the game. With those three alone, my gameplay scores would be much higher, but then there's the performance, which needs a lot of work. It's definitely a game I'll be mentioning in the next all patched up video, in the hope that the developer put in the effort needed to bring this where it should be. It scores an overall SwitchUp score at the moment of 69%. It's funny, you can probably hear that I like the game, but I am quite frustrated by some of the choices it's made. Let me know in the comments what you think of this one. Personally, I wouldn't be purchasing it in this state. I'd be waiting for a patch or a sale. A big thanks to the developer for the review copy, and also a huge thank you to Rode Microphones. Now I let them know that my past microphone was absolute trash, which it was like an Amazon bargain basement job, and they offered to send us across a couple of their new NT USB minis, which are delightful to hold and use, and hopefully they sound okay. Thanks to our patrons who support us each and every month, and to all of you who leave comments down below. It is one of the highlights of making these videos. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!